Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight, we travel to the Highlands of Scotland in November of 1908, to the platform of King's Cross Station in the blue hour before dawn, where the gas lamps cast pools of amber light upon the granite, and the air smells of coal smoke and the distant promise of snow. Among them is Arthur Finch, a 42-year-old clockmaker and horologist, carrying one leather valise, one mahogany traveling case of tools, and the quiet, persistent ache of a wife who had died 3 autumns past, and whose absence still visited him each evening at the precise hour of 7:30. He expects only a modest, ordinary comfort: a berth on the night train, a cup of tea in the dining car, the simple relief of a journey that would take him away from London for a week. But the train that night carried more than passengers, and in the compartment next to his own sat a woman whose eyes held the same shade of loneliness as his own, though she wore it differently, like a coat turned inside out. This is the story of Arthur Finch, and of one winter night when a clockmaker, who had spent his life measuring the passage of hours, discovered that time, properly understood, was not a thing to be counted, but a thing to be released. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the sleeping berth carry you through steam and sleep. The station clock read 10 minutes past 11 when Arthur Finch first set foot upon platform 9, and he noted the discrepancy immediately. The great dial above the ticket office was 3 minutes slow, a fault he could see from the peculiar lag in the sweep of the second hand, which stuttered almost imperceptibly at the 50-second mark. He made a mental note of it, as he had made mental notes of every timepiece he had encountered in the 30 years since he had first been apprenticed to a clockmaker on Clerkenwell Road, and then he dismissed the thought with a small, rueful shake of his head. This was precisely the kind of observation that Margaret had always teased him about: the way he could not pass a church tower or a railway station without checking the alignment of its hands, the way he would pause in the middle of a conversation to correct a mantel clock that was running fast, the way his fingers would twitch toward a regulator screw as though drawn by an invisible thread. She had called it his affliction, but she had said it with affection. And in the 3 years since she had gone, the affliction had become something else entirely, a kind of anchor, a fixed point in a world that had otherwise lost all reliable measure. He adjusted the strap of his valise on his shoulder and walked toward the train. The Highland sleeper stood waiting in the gloom, its brass fittings catching the light of the gas lamps, its steam hissing softly from beneath the carriage, as though the great iron beast were breathing in its sleep. The carriages were painted in the deep maroon of the Caledonian Railway, and along their sides ran the words, "London to Inverness," in gold leaf, the letters slightly raised beneath his fingertips as he passed. He found his compartment, carriage D, berth number 7, and slid the door open with a sound of well-oiled brass and polished wood. The compartment was small but well appointed, a narrow room of mahogany paneling and green velvet upholstery, with a single berth folded against the wall and a washstand in the corner, with a porcelain basin and a jug of water. A lamp burned low on the wall, its flame turned down to a soft amber glow, and the window was open a crack, letting in the cold November air and the smell of the station. Arthur set his valise on the seat and his mahogany case on the floor beside it, and then he stood for a moment, with his hands in his pockets, looking at the small space that would be his home for the next 12 hours. He had not slept properly in 3 years, not through the night, not in the way that sleep was meant to be, that deep, uninterrupted descent into unconsciousness from which one woke feeling restored. He slept in fragments, in shallow pools of rest that broke against the shore of wakefulness at the slightest disturbance. He slept with one ear open, as though waiting for a sound that never came, a footstep on the stair, a voice calling his name from the next room. He had tried everything that the doctors and the apothecaries could recommend: laudanum, warm milk at bedtime, a strict regimen of evening walks, a glass of sherry before retiring. But nothing had eased the particular vigilance of his grief. His body had learned to stay awake, and it had forgotten how to surrender. The guard's whistle sounded from somewhere up the platform, a long, lonely note that seemed to hang in the air like a question. Arthur heard the hiss of steam increase, felt the floor beneath him tremble with the first stirring of the engine, and then the train began to move, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though it were waking from a very long dream. He sat down on the velvet seat and watched the platform slide past the window. The gas lamps, the porters in their blue uniforms, the great clock with its faulty second hand, and then they were under the vaulted roof of the station, and then they were out of it entirely, and the lights of London began to scatter like seeds thrown into the dark. Arthur Finch had been born above a clock shop on Clerkenwell Road in the year 1866, and the first sound he had heard, according to his mother, was not a cry, but the chiming of the half-hour from the bracket clock on the landing. She had told him this story many times, always with the same mixture of fondness and exasperation, as though she had known from that moment that her son belonged to time in a way that other children did not. His father had been a clockmaker of the old school, a man who could repair a verge escapement by touch alone, and who spoke of the longitude prize as other men spoke of the derby. Arthur had grown up among the ticking and the chiming, the smell of brass polish and linseed oil, the glass cases of pocket watches and carriage clocks, the quiet industry of a trade that had been practiced in the same street for 200 years. He had inherited the shop when his father died in 1892, and he had run it with the same meticulous care, taking on apprentices and teaching them the old ways, the hand-cutting of wheels and the filing of pinions, the delicate adjustment of balance springs and the patient regulation of pendulums. He had been content in his work, perhaps more than content. He had been absorbed, in the way that a man can be absorbed when his hands are busy and his mind is quiet and the hours pass without notice. And then he had met Margaret at a church bazaar in Islington, where she had been selling jars of marmalade and he had been fixing the vicar's watch for free, and something in his carefully ordered life had shifted, like a weight falling from a scale. She had been a music teacher, a pianist with small, strong hands and a laugh that could fill a room. She had understood his affliction, or at least she had tolerated it with good humor, and she had taught him that there were other ways of measuring time, besides the swing of a pendulum, the duration of a chord, the length of a breath, the space between one heartbeat and the next. They had been married for 11 years, and in those years Arthur had learned to sleep beside another person, to adjust his breathing to hers, to wake slowly and without alarm. He had learned for the first time in his life that time could be something other than a series of ticks and talks, that it could flow like water, like music, like the slow drift of a hand across a keyboard. And then she had fallen ill in the autumn of 1905, and the illness had taken her slowly, over the course of 3 months, and Arthur had watched her fade like a clock running down, its spring unwinding, its pendulum slowing, until at last it stopped. He had been with her at the end, holding her hand, and he had felt the exact moment when the rhythm of her breathing changed, when the space between one breath and the next became too long, and then there was no next breath, and the room was silent. He had sat there for a long time, still holding her hand, and he had not known what to do with the silence. He had been measuring time all his life, but he had never known what to do with its absence. The months that followed had been a kind of slow drowning. He had kept the shop open, had continued to repair clocks and watches, because the work was the only thing that still made sense. He would sit at his bench in the back room, with the magnifying loupe in his eye and the tweezers in his hand, and he would lose himself, in the tiny gears and springs, the delicate architecture of time itself. But the evenings were harder. The evenings were when the silence became unbearable, when the house in Islington felt too large and too empty, when the clock on the mantelpiece seemed to be mocking him with its steady, indifferent rhythm. He had taken to walking, in the evenings, through the streets of London, past the lighted windows of houses where families were sitting down to dinner, past the pubs where men were laughing and drinking, past the churches where the bells were ringing the hour, and he had felt like a ghost, invisible and untouchable, moving through a world that had no place for him. It was his doctor, a man named Thornton, who had finally suggested the journey. "You need a change of scene," Thornton had said, in his blunt, no-nonsense way. "You need to get out of London, away from the shop, away from the house. Go somewhere you've never been. See something you've never seen. You're a clockmaker, Arthur. You of all people should understand that a stopped clock is no use to anyone. You need to be wound again." Arthur had laughed, a dry, hollow sound, but he had taken the advice. He had booked a berth on the Highland sleeper to Aviemore, a village in the Cairngorms, that he had read about in a railway guidebook, a place of pine forests and lochs, and mountains that rose like dark waves against the sky. He had no particular reason for choosing Aviemore, except that it was far away and quiet, and the name itself sounded like a kind of sleep, a soft, three-syllable exhale. He had packed his valise with the essentials: shirts, socks, a heavy coat, a book of poetry that Margaret had given him, and he had packed his mahogany case with his tools, because he could not bear to leave them behind. They were the only things that still felt real to him, the only things that still had weight. The shop at 47 Clerkenwell Road had been in the Finch family for 3 generations, and it had changed very little in that time. The front window still displayed the same assortment of clocks and watches, arranged on velvet cushions and brass stands, with a small card in the corner that read, "Finch and Son, Horologists, established 1804. The door still had a bell that rang with a particular pitch when a customer entered, a pitch that Arthur could identify from the back room, where he spent most of his days. The shelves still held the same books, the same catalogues, the same boxes of spare parts, and the same smell of oil and metal and old wood that had been there since his grandfather's time. Arthur's routine was precise, almost ritualistic. He rose at 6:30, winter and summer alike, and he made himself a pot of tea in the kitchen at the back of the shop. He drank it standing at the window, looking out at the street, watching the milk carts and the newspaper boys and the early morning traffic that moved through Clerkenwell like blood through a vein. At 7, he unlocked the front door and turned the sign to open, and then he sat down at his bench and began the work of the day. The bench was his true home, the place where the world fell away and time became something he could hold in his hands. It was a heavy oak table, scarred and stained with decades of use, with a green felt cover and a row of small drawers beneath the surface. Each drawer held a specific category of tools: tweezers and screwdrivers in the first, files and brooches in the second, oil pots and brushes in the third, and so on, in an order that Arthur had memorized so thoroughly that he could reach for any tool without looking. The magnifying loupe hung from a hook above the bench, and the lamp beside it cast a circle of bright light onto the work surface, illuminating the tiny gears and springs that lay scattered across the felt, like the bones of some delicate, mechanical creature. The work itself was a kind of meditation. Arthur would take a clock or a watch that had been brought to him for repair, and he would begin by listening to it, holding it close to his ear, and letting the sound of its ticking tell him what was wrong. A watch that was running fast had a different sound from a watch that was running slow. A watch with a broken mainspring had a different silence from a watch with a worn escapement. And he had learned to read these sounds the way a musician reads a score. and he had learned to trust his ear more than his eyes, because the ear could hear what the eye could not see, the subtle irregularities, the tiny hesitations, the almost imperceptible variations in rhythm that betrayed a fault. He would then take the watch apart, carefully, methodically, laying each piece on the felt in the order in which he had removed it. He would clean each piece with a soft brush and a solution of benzene, and he would examine each piece under the loupe, looking for wear, for damage, for the tiny imperfections that could throw a watch out of time. He would make his repairs, filing a worn pivot, replacing a broken spring, adjusting the angle of a pallet, and then he would reassemble the watch, oiling each pivot with a drop of oil so small that it could only be applied with a single strand of wire. And then he would wind the watch and set it running, and he would listen to it again, and he would adjust it, and he would listen again, until the ticking was as steady and even as a heartbeat. It was work that required patience, and Arthur had patience in abundance. He could spend an entire day on a single watch, losing himself in the tiny movements of his hands, the slow progress of the work, the satisfaction of bringing a broken thing back to life. He had repaired watches that had been passed down through 5 generations, watches that had crossed oceans and continents, watches that had stopped on battlefields and in hospital rooms, and in the pockets of men who had died without winding them. Each watch had a story, though Arthur rarely asked what it was. He preferred to let the watch speak for itself, to tell him through its ticks and its talks what it had been through and what it needed. But in the evenings, when the shop was closed and the work was put away, the silence returned. Arthur would sit in the parlor above the shop, with a glass of sherry and the book of poetry that Margaret had given him, and he would listen to the clocks. There were 7 clocks in the parlor, a long case in the corner, a bracket clock on the mantelpiece, a carriage clock on the sideboard, and 4 smaller clocks on the walls, and they all kept different time. Not wrong time, exactly, but different time, each one running at its own pace, each one chiming the hour at a slightly different moment, so that the room was filled with a constant, overlapping chorus of bells and chimes. Margaret had loved it, had said it sounded like a forest of birds, but to Arthur, it had begun to sound like a room full of voices, all speaking at once, all saying the same thing in different ways, and none of them saying anything he could understand. The train had been moving for perhaps 20 minutes when Arthur rose from his seat and began to explore. He had always been a restless traveler, unable to sit still for long, and the narrow compartment, for all its comfort, had begun to feel like a cage. He slid the door open and stepped into the corridor, where the gas lamps were burning low and the carpet beneath his feet was thick and soft. The train swayed gently as it gathered speed, a rhythmic motion that was almost hypnotic, and the wheels sang their endless song against the rails, a steady, repeating pattern of sound that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The corridor was empty, the other passengers already settled into their compartments for the night. Arthur walked slowly, his hand resting on the brass rail that ran along the wall, and he looked out of the windows at the darkness that was streaming past. They were still in the outskirts of London, passing through the suburbs where the houses were set back from the tracks, and the lights in the windows were few and far between. He saw a church spire against the sky, a row of terraced houses, a bridge with a gas lamp at either end, and then they were in open country, and there was nothing to see but the dark shapes of fields and hedgerows and the occasional gleam of a river. He found the dining car at the end of the second carriage, a long, elegant room of polished mahogany and white linen, with lamps on the tables and a steward in a white jacket standing by the door. The car was nearly empty, only 2 other passengers, a long, elderly couple at a table near the window, drinking tea and speaking in low voices. Arthur chose a table at the far end, by the window, and sat down with a sigh that was half relief and half something else, something he could not quite name. The steward brought him a pot of tea and a plate of sandwiches, and Arthur ate slowly, without appetite, watching the darkness outside the window. The train was passing through a small town now. He could see the lights of houses, a railway station, a signal box with a red lamp burning, and then they were out again, into the darkness, and the rhythm of the wheels settled into a steady, hypnotic beat. He thought about Margaret, as he always did when he was alone and still. He thought about the way she had looked the last time he had seen her, lying in the bed they had shared for 11 years, her face pale and thin, her hand cold in his. He thought about the things he had said to her, and the things he had not said, and the way the silence had stretched between them, like a thread that was about to break. He had told her that he loved her, of course, many times, but he had never told her that she had taught him how to live, how to be in the world without measuring it, how to let time pass without counting it. He had never told her that she had been the only thing that had ever made the ticking stop. He finished his tea and left the dining car, walking back through the corridor to his compartment. The train was moving faster now, the rhythm of the wheels quicker and more insistent, and the gas lamps in the corridor flickered as the carriage swayed. He reached his compartment and slid the door open, and he was about to step inside when he heard a sound that made him stop, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the compartment next to his own. It was a familiar sound, though he could not immediately place it. He stood in the corridor, listening, and then he realized what it was. It was the sound of a typewriter, the keys striking the paper in a steady, measured rhythm, the carriage returning with a soft thump at the end of each line. Someone was writing, in the compartment next to his, in the middle of the night, on a train bound for the Highlands. He stood there for a moment, listening to the rhythm, and he found it oddly comforting. It was a human sound, a sound of work and purpose, a sound that cut through the silence of the train and the darkness outside. He thought about knocking on the door, introducing himself, but he did not. He stepped into his own compartment, closed the door, and sat down on the edge of the berth, still listening to the tapping of the keys through the thin wall. The train carried on, northward, into the night, and the typewriter continued its steady rhythm, and Arthur Finch, for the first time in 3 years, felt something that might have been the beginning of curiosity. The train had passed through Peterborough when Arthur finally lay down on the berth, though he did not expect to sleep. He had learned, over the past 3 years, not to expect sleep, and he had learned to be grateful for the small mercies of rest, the moments of drowsiness, the half-dreams that flickered at the edges of consciousness, the quiet hours when the mind grew still and the body stopped its constant vigilance. He lay on his back, with his hands behind his head, and he watched the shadows of the compartment shift and sway as the train carried him north. The berth was narrow but comfortable, the mattress firm and the pillows soft, and the sheets smelled of lavender and clean linen. Arthur had folded his coat and placed it at the foot of the berth, and he had set his mahogany case on the floor beside him, within reach, as though it were a talisman that could protect him from the night. The lamp on the wall was still burning, turned down to its lowest setting, and the light it cast was soft and warm, like the light of a candle. He thought about the typewriter, about the person in the next compartment who was writing in the middle of the night. He wondered what they were writing. A letter, perhaps, or a story, or a diary. He wondered if they were traveling alone, as he was, and if they were running from something, or towards something. He wondered if they, too, had trouble sleeping, and if the rhythm of the typewriter was a way of keeping the silence at bay. The train slowed as it approached a station, and Arthur heard the guard calling out the name, Grantham, a place he had never been, a name that sounded like a stone dropped into still water. The train stopped, and there was a moment of absolute silence, broken only by the hiss of steam and the distant barking of a dog. Arthur heard footsteps on the platform, Voices, the sound of a door opening and closing, and then the train began to move again, slowly at first, then faster, and the rhythm of the wheels resumed its steady beat. He closed his eyes, and he let the motion of the train carry him into a state that was not quite sleep, but not quite wakefulness. He was aware of the sounds around him, the creak of the carriage, the whistle of the wind outside the window, the distant tapping of the typewriter in the next compartment, but they seemed to come from a great distance, as though they were happening in another world. He thought about Margaret, about the way she had used to hum when she was reading, a soft, absent-minded sound that had always made him smile. He thought about the shop, about the clocks on the wall, about the steady, patient work of repair. He thought about the journey ahead, about the mountains and the lochs and the village of Aviemore, a place he had never seen, a place that existed only in his imagination. And then, without warning, he felt the first stirring of something he had not felt in a long time, a loosening, a softening, a letting go. It was not sleep, not yet, but it was the beginning of sleep, the first step on the long road down. He felt his breathing slow, his muscles relax, his mind grow quiet. He felt the weight of the day, the weight of the years, pressing down on him, and he did not resist. He let the weight carry him, let it pull him down into the darkness, and he did not fight it. The train passed through Newark, and then through Retford, and then through Doncaster, and the hours passed like water through a sieve. Arthur drifted in and out of consciousness, never quite sleeping, never quite awake, suspended in a state of gentle, floating awareness. He heard the guard calling out the names of stations, York, Darlington, Durham, and he saw the lights of towns and cities flicker past the window, and he felt the train climb and descend, as the land rose and fell beneath it. At some point, he heard the typewriter stop. The silence that followed was sudden and complete, and Arthur found himself listening for the sound, waiting for it to resume, but it did not. The person in the next compartment had stopped writing, and the train was quiet, and the night was still, and Arthur Finch, alone in his berth, felt the absence of the sound like a presence, like a companion who had been there and was now gone. He turned onto his side, pulling the blanket up to his chin, and he watched the shadows of the compartment shift and dance. The train was climbing now, the engine laboring against the gradient, and the rhythm of the wheels had changed, become slower, heavier, more deliberate. They were entering the hills, the first gentle slopes of the Pennines, and the air outside the window had grown cold, cold enough that Arthur could see his breath when he exhaled. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as though the sun itself were reluctant to rise over the gray November landscape. Arthur woke from his shallow doze to find the world outside his window transformed. The flat fields of the south had given way to rolling hills, the hills to low mountains, and the mountains to a vast, open landscape of moor and heath, with patches of snow in the hollows, and a sky that was the color of old pewter. The train was passing through a valley, following the course of a river that ran swift and dark between banks of bare trees, and the smoke from the engine hung low over the carriages, trailing behind them like a banner. Arthur sat up, rubbing his eyes, and looked out of the window. He had not slept, not really, but he had rested, and the rest had done him good. His mind felt clearer than it had in weeks, his body less heavy, and he found himself looking at the landscape with something like interest. He had never been this far north before, and the strangeness of the country, the bare, sweeping hills, the dark lochs, the scattered farms and villages, stirred something in him, a sense of possibility, of newness, of a world that existed outside the narrow confines of his grief. He washed his face in the basin, using the cold water from the jug, and he changed his shirt and combed his hair. He was about to leave the compartment when he noticed a small envelope that had been pushed under the door. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was plain white, unmarked, with no name or address. He opened it, and inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in half, with a short message written in a neat, precise hand. I heard you listening last night. I hope the sound was not a disturbance. If you would care to join me for breakfast in the dining car, I would be grateful for the company. Compartment 8. Arthur read the message twice, a small smile touching his lips. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket, and then he stepped out into the corridor and made his way to the dining car. The woman was already there, sitting at a table by the window, with a cup of tea in front of her and a notebook open on the table beside her plate. She was perhaps 50, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun and a face that was lined and weathered but not unkind. She wore a traveling dress of dark blue wool, with a brooch at her collar in the shape of a thistle, and her hands, resting on the table, were strong and capable, the hands of someone who had worked with them all her life. Arthur hesitated at the door, suddenly unsure of himself. He was not a man who made friends easily, and the thought of sitting down with a stranger, of making conversation, of opening himself to the possibility of connection, filled him with a kind of quiet dread. But the woman had invited him, and he had accepted, and it would be rude to turn back now. He took a breath, squared his shoulders, and walked to her table. "Good morning," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "I received your note. I'm Arthur Finch, from compartment 7. The woman looked up, and her eyes, when they met his, were the color of the winter sky, gray with flecks of blue and deep and old. She smiled, a small, tired smile, and gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please, sit," she said. "I'm Eleanor McBride, and I must apologize for the typewriter. I know it's an inconsiderate habit, but I find I cannot sleep on trains, and the work keeps my mind from wandering." Arthur sat down, and the steward appeared almost immediately, pouring him a cup of tea and taking his order for breakfast. He looked at Eleanor, at the notebook open on the table, at the pen lying beside it. "May I ask what you're writing?" he said. Eleanor hesitated, and then she closed the notebook and set it aside. "A history," she said, "of the old roads of Scotland, the drove roads, the cattle roads, the paths that the drovers used to take their herds to market. I've been walking them for the past 10 years, mapping them, recording the stories of the people who used them. It's a slow work, and I'm not sure it will ever be finished, but it keeps me moving." She said it simply, without self-importance, and Arthur found himself nodding, understanding. "A map maker," he said. "Something like that," she said. "And you? What brings you to the Highlands in November?" Arthur looked down at his tea, at the steam rising from the surface, at the small, perfect circles of light that danced on the liquid. He thought about telling her the truth, that he was running from grief, that he had not slept in 3 years, that he had come to Aviemore because the name sounded like a kind of sleep, but the words would not come. Instead, he said, "A change of scene. I'm a clockmaker, and I've been in London too long." Eleanor looked at him, and he had the strange feeling that she could see through him, that she could read the truth in the lines of his face, in the way he held his hands, in the shadows under his eyes. But she did not press him. She simply nodded and picked up her cup and said, "Then you've come to the right place. The Highlands have a way of changing things." Breakfast passed in a slow, comfortable rhythm, the kind of conversation that flows easily between strangers who have no expectations of each other. Eleanor spoke of her work, of the drove roads she had walked, of the villages and bothies and ruined crofts she had found along the way. She spoke of the map she was making, not a map of lines and distances, but a map of stories, the places where a drover had lost his way in a blizzard, the hill where a cattle thief had been hanged, the loch where a drowned girl was said to rise on the night of the full moon. She spoke of the land itself, the way it changed with the seasons, the way the light fell on the mountains, the way the wind moved through the passes. Arthur listened, and as he listened, he found himself relaxing into the sound of her voice. It was a low, steady voice, with a Scottish accent that softened the edges of her words, and it carried the rhythm of someone who had spent a long time alone, speaking to herself in the silence of the hills. She did not ask him questions, did not pry into his life, and he was grateful for that. She simply talked, and he listened, and the train carried them north. They passed through Edinburgh as the morning wore on, the train threading its way through the city's outskirts, past the castle on its rock, and the spires of the old town, and the grey, glittering waters of the Firth of Forth. Arthur watched from the window as the city fell away, replaced by the rolling hills of Fife, and then the train crossed the Forth Bridge, a vast iron structure that seemed to hang in the air like a dream, and Arthur felt a strange, vertiginous thrill, as though they were flying. Eleanor had fallen silent, and she was looking out of the window with an expression that Arthur could not read. He followed her gaze, and he saw the mountains rising in the distance, blue and purple and gray, their peaks dusted with snow, their slopes dark with pine forests. They were the Cairngorms, the mountains that guarded the passes to the Highlands, and they seemed to Arthur like the walls of a vast, silent cathedral, ancient and indifferent and full of a kind of terrible beauty. "Have you ever been to Aviemore?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "No, but I know the country around it, the Spey Valley, the Rothiemurchus Forest, the lochs. It's a quiet place, in the winter. The tourists don't come until the summer, and the snow keeps the roads closed. It's a good place to be alone." She said it without judgment, as though being alone were a neutral thing, neither good nor bad. Arthur thought about that, about the way she had said it, and he realized that she was not afraid of solitude, as he was. She had made peace with it, had learned to live with it, had even found a kind of purpose in it. He wondered how she had done that, and he wondered if he could learn to do the same. The train stopped at a small station, and the guard called out the name, Pitlochry, a place that sounded like a line of poetry. Arthur saw the platform, the stone buildings, the hills rising behind them, and he felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to get off the train, to walk into the hills, to disappear into the landscape and never come back. He did not act on it, of course. He sat where he was, and he watched the platform slide past, and he thought about the clock shop in Clerkenwell, and the clocks on the wall, and the silence of the parlor in the evenings. Eleanor was watching him, he realized. She had turned in her seat, and she was looking at him with those gray, knowing eyes, and she said, "You're looking for something." It was not a question. Arthur met her gaze, and he felt the truth of her words settle into him like a stone dropped into still water. "Yes," he said, and the word surprised him. "I think I am." She nodded, and she did not ask what it was. She simply turned back to the window, and she said, "The mountains have a way of showing you what you're looking for, but you have to be willing to see it." The train began to move again, and the mountains grew closer, and the sky grew darker, and the first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting past the window like the feathers of 1,000 birds. Arthur watched them, and he thought about the journey ahead, and he thought about the woman beside him, and he thought about the strange, quiet hope that had begun to stir in his chest, like a clock that had been wound for the first time in years. The train climbed steadily into the hills, its engine laboring against the gradient, and the snow fell thicker now, blanketing the landscape in a soft, white silence. Arthur watched the flakes gather on the window glass, each one a tiny, perfect hexagon that melted almost instantly into a bead of water, and he thought about the clocks in his shop, the way the second hands moved in their unceasing, mechanical march. He had spent 3 years watching those hands move, measuring time that felt empty and endless, and now, For the first time in memory, he was watching something that had no measurement at all: the snow, the mountains, the slow drift of the day into afternoon. Eleanor had refilled her teacup, and she held it in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. She did not look at him when she spoke, but her voice carried across the table with the same easy rhythm she had used all morning. There is a drove road that runs from the head of Loch Tay up through the hills to the Spey Valley. I walked it 2 summers ago, in July, when the heather was in bloom, and the air was thick with the smell of honey. It took me 4 days, and I did not see another soul for 3 of them. The road was old, older than the Romans, older than the clans, older than any map that has ever been drawn. It was worn into the earth by the hooves of cattle and the feet of men who lived and died without leaving any record of their names. She paused, and Arthur heard the weight of her words settle into the compartment. I camped one night beside a locan, a small, dark body of water that lay in the shadow of a hill called Meal Nan Tarmacan, and the water was so still that I could see the reflection of every star, and I sat there for a long time, watching the sky turn, and I thought about all the people who had passed that way before me, and I thought about how little we leave behind when we go. A stone, a bone, a story that fades after a generation. And yet, the road remains, the path remains. It does not remember us, but it holds us, somehow. Arthur listened, and he felt a strange, quiet resonance in his chest, as though she were speaking directly to the grief that he had carried for so long. He thought about his wife, about the way she had looked in the hospital bed, the way her hand had felt in his, the way the light had left her eyes. He thought about the years since, the clocks he had repaired, the meals he had eaten alone, the nights he had lain awake, listening to the silence. He had left nothing behind. He had left no mark on the world. He was like a clock that had stopped, its hands frozen at a single, unchanging hour. Eleanor turned to him, and her eyes were soft, and she said, "You're thinking about her." He did not ask how she knew. He simply nodded, and he felt the tears prick at the corners of his eyes, and he did not try to stop them. They came slowly, silently, running down his cheeks and dripping onto his hands, and he let them come. Eleanor waited, patient as the hills. She did not offer comfort, did not reach across the table, did not say the empty words that people say when they do not know what else to do. She simply waited, and her presence was enough. After a long moment, Arthur spoke. Her name was Margaret. She died 3 years ago. Consumption. It took her slowly, over the course of a year, and I could do nothing but watch. I am a clockmaker. I fix things, but I could not fix her. His voice broke, and he stopped, and he looked out at the snow, at the white world that was passing by. I have not slept properly since. I lie awake, and I think about her, and I count the hours until dawn. I thought that if I could just get away, if I could just go somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the city, I might find some peace. But I do not know if peace is something you can find. I think it is something you have to make. Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the mountains. The drove roads were not built for comfort, she said. They were built for movement. They led from one place to another, and they did not promise rest, or shelter, or safety. They only promised that you would arrive somewhere, eventually, somewhere different from where you started. She turned to him, and her voice was low and steady. You have already begun the journey, Arthur. You have left London. You have boarded the train. You are moving. The rest will come, in its own time, if you let it. Arthur wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and he felt a small, fragile thread of something that might have been hope. He did not speak, but he nodded, and Eleanor smiled, a thin, knowing smile, and she turned back to the window. The train passed through a narrow valley, and the snow grew deeper, and the trees that lined the track were heavy with white, their branches bent low under the weight. The sky had turned a pale, gray-white, the color of old bone, and the light was soft and diffuse, casting no shadows. The world had become a watercolor, all washes and tints, and Arthur felt himself sinking into it, the way a stone sinks into still water. They came to a station, a small, stone building with a painted sign that read, King Gussie. The train stopped, and a few passengers got off, their breath pluming in the cold air. Arthur watched them cross the platform, their figures small against the white hills, and he felt a pang of loneliness that was not entirely unpleasant. It was the loneliness of being between places, of being nowhere in particular, of being suspended in the quiet space between one life and another. Eleanor stood up and stretched, her joints cracking softly. "I think I will take a walk down the corridor," she said. "The legs need stretching. Would you like to join me?" Arthur looked at the snow-covered platform, at the hills beyond, at the small village that huddled under the weight of the winter sky. He thought about staying in his seat, about sinking deeper into his own thoughts, but something in Eleanor's voice made him rise. He followed her into the corridor, and they walked together to the end of the coach, where a small observation platform offered a view of the track ahead. The train stood still, its engine breathing, and the silence was so complete that Arthur could hear the sound of snowflakes landing on the roof. He stood beside Eleanor, their shoulders almost touching, and he looked at the mountains that rose like sleeping giants on either side of the valley. They were not beautiful in the way of the Alps or the Lake District. They were old and weathered and indifferent. They had been there before the first man walked the earth, and they would be there long after the last man was gone. And yet, in that moment, standing in the cold, quiet air, Arthur felt a strange kinship with them. He was old and weathered and indifferent too. Eleanor said, "The guard told me we will reach Aviemore in about an hour. The snow is slowing us down, but we will get there." Arthur nodded. "And then what?" "And then we will see," she said. "That is the nature of journeys. You arrive, and you see what there is to see." The train whistle blew, a long, lonely sound that echoed through the valley, and the engine began to move again, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The snow swirled around the train, and the mountains seemed to draw closer, and Arthur felt the first stirrings of something he had not felt in a long time, the quiet, unwilled patience of a clock that simply keeps time, not knowing or caring what it measures. The train slowed as it entered the station at Aviemore, and Arthur saw a platform of gray stone, a small wooden building with a sign that read Aviemore in white letters, and beyond it, the mountains rising like a wall of ancient bone. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained low and white, and the air was so cold that Arthur could feel it pressing against the glass of the window, seeping through the cracks, chilling the compartment. He gathered his bag and his satchel, and he followed Eleanor onto the platform. The cold hit him like a wave, sharp and clean, and he took a deep breath, letting it fill his lungs. The air smelled of pine and snow, and something else, something earthy and old, like peat or wet stone. It was a good smell, a clean smell, and Arthur felt his shoulders drop, felt the tension that had been coiled in his neck begin to ease. The station was nearly empty. A porter in a heavy coat stood by the ticket office, and a few passengers from the train were walking toward the village, their footsteps leaving dark prints in the fresh snow. Arthur stood on the platform, his bag at his feet, and he looked around, taking in the low, white buildings, the bare trees, the hills that rose on every side like the walls of a great, quiet room. Eleanor had stopped beside him, and she was pulling on a pair of thick woolen gloves. She looked at him and said, "There is a hotel just up the road, the Cairngorm Arms. It is not grand, but it is warm, and the food is good. I know the woman who runs it, Mrs. MacLeod. She will find you a room." Arthur nodded, and they began to walk, their boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The road led away from the station, past a small post office, a church with a stone spire, and a row of cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys. The village was quiet, hushed by the snow, and the only sound was the muffled crunch of their footsteps and the distant murmur of a river running somewhere beyond the trees. The Cairngorm Arms was a low, whitewashed building with a slate roof and a wooden sign that creaked softly in the breeze. Eleanor pushed open the door, and a wave of warmth and light and the smell of wood smoke and cooking food washed over them. The interior was cozy and old, with low ceilings and dark wooden beams, and a fire burning in a great stone hearth. A woman with gray hair and a round, cheerful face rose from a chair by the fire and greeted Eleanor with a smile. "Eleanor, it is good to see you again, and you have brought a guest." Eleanor introduced Arthur, and Mrs. MacLeod showed him to a room on the first floor, a small room with a window that looked out over the hills. There was a bed with a patchwork quilt, a wooden chair, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a small fireplace that was already burning, a low, steady flame that threw shadows on the walls. Arthur set down his bag and his satchel, and he stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered slope that rose behind the hotel, at the bare birch trees that stood like white ghosts against the gray sky. He was here. He had arrived. And yet, the sense of arrival was not what he had expected. He had thought that reaching Aviemore would bring some kind of resolution, some kind of answer, but instead, he felt only a quiet, empty calm, like the stillness of a clock that has stopped at a moment of perfect balance. He unpacked his few belongings, a change of clothes, a book of poetry he had not opened in years, his shaving kit, and the photograph of Margaret that he had carried in his coat pocket since the day she died. He set the photograph on the mantelpiece, and he looked at her face, at her smile, at the way her hair had curled around her ears. He had not looked at it in months. He had kept it folded in his pocket, but he had not let himself see it. Now he looked, and he felt the grief rise up, not as a sharp pain, but as a slow, sad tide, like the memory of a dream that fades as you wake. He stood there for a long time, and then he turned away, and he went downstairs to find Eleanor. She was sitting by the fire, a glass of whiskey in her hand, and she gestured for him to join her. Mrs. MacLeod brought him a glass as well, and Arthur sat down, and they sat in silence, watching the flames. The fire crackled and popped, and the logs shifted, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the darkness was falling, and the world beyond the windows had become a soft, deep blue. Eleanor said, "Do you know why I walk the drove roads?" Arthur shook his head. "Because they are old," she said. "Because they have been walked by so many people, for so many centuries, that the earth itself has absorbed their stories. I walk them, and I feel those stories in my bones. I feel the weight of all the feet that have gone before me. And I think I am part of something. I am not alone." She looked into the fire, and her voice grew softer. "I lost someone too, a long time ago, a man I loved. He was a geologist, and he died in the mountains, in a landslide, on a summer afternoon. They never found his body. I walked the hills for weeks, looking for him, and I never found a trace, and so I began to walk the roads, the old roads, the roads that had been walked by other people who had lost things, and I found that the walking itself was enough, and it did not bring him back. It did not answer any questions, but it carried me forward." Arthur looked at the fire, and he thought about the clocks in his shop, the way they measured time with such precision, the way they divided the day into uniform, unfeeling hours. He thought about the 3 years he had spent trying to measure his grief, trying to contain it, trying to make it fit into the neat compartments of a clock's face. And he realized, for the first time, that grief could not be measured. It could not be wound up or wound down. It could only be walked through, like a road that leads somewhere you cannot see. He lifted his glass, and he took a sip of the whiskey, and the warmth spread through his chest, slow and steady. He did not speak, but he felt something shift inside him, a small, quiet movement, like the first tick of a clock that has been silent for years. The fire burned low, and the whiskey glass was empty, and Eleanor began to speak in a voice that was not quite a story and not quite a confession, but something in between, a thread of words pulled from a long, deep well. She told Arthur about the geologist, a man named Hamish, who had loved the mountains with a passion that bordered on madness. He had spent his life studying the bones of the earth, the layers of rock and sediment that told the story of millions of years. He had been tall and thin, with a habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking, and he had laughed easily, a laugh that Eleanor said sounded like water running over stones. They had met in a library in Edinburgh, in a reading room that smelled of old paper and dust. She had been looking for a map of the old drove roads, and he had been looking for a treatise on the granite formations of the Cairngorms. They had shared a table, and they had talked for hours, and by the end of the afternoon, they had agreed to walk together in the hills the following summer. They had walked for 3 years, every summer, exploring the passes and the glens, the high plateaus and the hidden lochs. Hamish would stop every few hundred yards to examine a rock face, to chip off a sample, to make notes in a leather-bound journal. Eleanor would wander ahead, following the lines of the old roads, tracing the paths that the drovers had used, imagining the herds of cattle moving slowly through the mist. They had been happy, Eleanor said. They had been as happy as two people can be when they have found each other in a world that is vast and indifferent. And then, in the 4th summer, they had climbed a mountain called Ben Macdui, on a day when the clouds were low and the air was heavy with the promise of rain. Hamish had wanted to see a particular outcrop of schist, a formation that he believed had been formed by a glacier 10,000 years ago. Eleanor had stayed behind at the bothy, nursing a twisted ankle. She had waited for him to come back, and he had not come. She had waited for 3 days, and then the search party had gone out, and they had found nothing. The mountain had swallowed him, as mountains do, and there had been no trace, no body, no last word. Just the silence of the high places, the wind over the scree, the slow, patient erasing of a man's existence. Eleanor had not wept, she said. She had not known how. She had simply stopped, as a clock stops when its spring has run down. She had left Edinburgh, and she had walked the drove roads, and she had kept walking, year after year, until the walking had become a kind of living, a kind of breathing, a way of being in the world without needing to be anywhere. "I do not look for him anymore," she said, her voice steady. "I have stopped looking, but I have not stopped walking. The walking is what I do now. It is who I am." She looked at Arthur, and her eyes were dry, and her face was calm. "You do not have to fix it, Arthur. You do not have to find an answer. You only have to keep moving, and one day you will find that the movement itself has become the answer." Arthur sat in the silence that followed, and he felt the weight of her words settle into him like a stone dropped into deep water. He thought about the clocks he had repaired over the years, the old grandfather clocks, the delicate mantel clocks, the ship's chronometers with their gimbaled mechanisms. He had always thought of himself as a fixer, a man who could take something broken and make it work again. But grief was not a broken clock. Grief was a clock that had been taken apart and scattered across the floor, its pieces too small and too numerous to gather. You could not put it back together. You could only learn to live among the pieces. Mrs. MacLeod brought them a tray of supper, a bowl of broth, thick and dark, with chunks of potato and carrot, a plate of bread still warm from the oven, a wedge of cheese that smelled of the earth. They ate in silence, and the fire hissed and crackled, and the wind moaned softly around the eaves of the hotel. When the meal was finished, Eleanor rose and said she was tired. She bade Arthur good night, and she climbed the stairs to her room, leaving him alone by the fire. He sat for a long time, nursing a second glass of whiskey, watching the flames dwindle to embers, and he thought about the drove roads and the mountains and the woman who walked them, and he felt, for the first time in 3 years, a sense of something that was not quite peace, but a beginning of it, a thin, fragile thread of light in the darkness. He went to his room, and he undressed, and he lay down on the bed, and he listened to the silence of the Highland night. The clock on the mantel, a simple wooden case with a pendulum, ticked softly, and he counted the beats. 1, 2, 3, and then he stopped counting, and he let the sound wash over him. Arthur lay in the dark of his room, the patchwork quilt pulled up to his chin, and he listened to the sound of the house settling around him. The timbers creaked, the pipes gurgled, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. The clock on the mantel ticked with a slow, steady rhythm, but it did not keep time the way his clocks did. It was not a device of measurement, but a companion, a quiet heartbeat in the darkness. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the way she had looked in the last weeks of her illness, the way the light had seemed to drain out of her, the way her hands had grown thin and translucent, like the wings of a moth. He had held her hand until the end, and when she had stopped breathing, he had sat in the chair beside the bed for hours, waiting for something to happen, for some sign that she was still there. But the room had grown cold, and the daylight had faded, and nothing had happened. She had simply ceased to be, as a clock ceases to tick when its spring has broken. He had not known what to do after that. He had gone through the motions of living, eating, working, sleeping, but the motions had been empty, mechanical, like the movement of a clock that has no purpose. He had repaired other people's clocks, had brought them back to life, but he had not been able to repair his own. He had become a clock that kept time, but did not feel time, did not mark the seconds and minutes and hours with any meaning. But tonight, lying in the dark, in a strange room, in a village he had never seen before, he felt something shift. It was not a dramatic change, not a sudden flood of light or understanding. It was a small, quiet loosening, like the untying of a knot that had been pulled too tight. He felt his shoulders relax, felt the tension in his jaw ease, felt the breath in his chest grow deeper and slower. He thought about Eleanor, about the story she had told him, about the way she had kept walking, despite the loss that had hollowed her out. She had not tried to forget Hamish. She had not tried to replace him. She had simply kept moving, and the movement had become a kind of remembrance, a way of honoring the love she had carried. Arthur closed his eyes, and he let the darkness settle around him. He thought about the drove roads, the old paths worn into the earth by the feet of countless travelers. He thought about the way the land held the memory of those journeys, the way the stories lingered in the stones and the streams and the wind. He thought about his own journey, the train from London, the snow, the mountains, the woman who had sat beside him and told him that movement was enough. And he felt, for the first time in 3 years, a desire to sleep, not to escape the grief, not to forget, but simply to rest, to let go of the vigilance he had maintained for so long. He had been holding himself together, holding the pieces of his life in place with sheer will, and now, in the quiet of the Highland night, he allowed himself to fall apart. He did not fight it. He did not try to keep his eyes open. He let his mind drift, like a boat released from its moorings, and he felt himself begin to sink into something soft and dark and warm. The clock ticked, the wind sighed, the fire in the grate crackled once, softly, and settled into a bed of embers. And Arthur Finch, clockmaker of Clerkenwell, stopped counting. He stopped measuring. He stopped trying to hold on. He let go. Sleep came, not as a sudden descent, but as a gradual rising, like a tide that creeps up a shore, inch by inch, until the sand is covered and the water is deep. Arthur felt it first in his feet, a heaviness that spread upward through his legs, his torso, his arms, a slow, warm weight that seemed to press him into the mattress. His breathing slowed, deepened, and the sound of it became a soft, rhythmic murmur, like the wind through the pines. He was aware of the room around him, the clock, the window, the faint glow of the dying fire, but the awareness was distant, blurred, as though he were looking at it through a pane of frosted glass. His thoughts, too, began to drift, fragmenting, like clouds dispersing across a wide, gray sky. Margaret's face floated before him, but it was not the face of her illness. It was the face of their early years, the face she had worn when she laughed, when she held his hand in the street, when she had stood in the doorway of his shop and called out a greeting. He saw her as she had been, and he did not feel the sharp pang of loss. He felt only a quiet, gentle ache, like the memory of a tune heard long ago. He was on a drove road, walking through a landscape that shimmered with a strange, luminous light. The path was worn and smooth, winding between low hills covered in heather and bracken. The sky was a deep, soft blue, and the air was warm and still, and he could hear the sound of a river somewhere ahead, a low, steady song. He walked without effort, his feet finding the path as if they had known it all his life. He turned a corner, and the river came into view, a wide, slow-moving water that reflected the sky like a mirror, and on the far bank he saw a figure, a woman in a white dress, her hair loose, her hand raised in a gesture that could have been a wave or a farewell. He tried to call out, but no sound came. The woman turned, and for a moment he saw her face clearly. It was Margaret, younger, fuller, her eyes bright and alive. She smiled, and then she turned away, and she walked into the trees that lined the riverbank, and she was gone. Arthur stopped, and he stood on the bank, and he watched the water flow past. He did not feel sadness. He did not feel loss. He felt only a deep, quiet acceptance, as though he had finally understood something he had always known, but had not been able to say. The road continued on the other side of the river, but there was no bridge, no ford. He looked at the water, and he knew that he could not cross it. Not now, not tonight. But that was all right. The road was not meant to be finished. It was meant to be walked. He opened his eyes, and for a moment, he did not know where he was. The room was dark, but a faint gray light seeped through the curtains, the first hint of dawn. The fire had gone out, and the air was cold, but he was warm under the quilt. He lay still, listening to the silence, and he realized that he had slept. He had slept through the night for the first time in 3 years. He did not move. He did not want to break the spell. He lay in the quiet darkness, and he felt the weight of sleep still clinging to him, a soft, heavy blanket that wrapped him in comfort. He thought about the dream, the river, the road, Margaret's smile, and he felt a strange, peaceful gratitude, as though he had been given a gift he did not deserve. The clock on the mantel ticked, a soft, regular beat, and Arthur let the sound carry him back, not into sleep, but into a state of deep, restful stillness. He closed his eyes, and he did not try to think, did not try to remember, did not try to plan. He simply was. The hours passed without measure. Arthur drifted on the currents of a sleep so profound that it seemed to have no edges, no boundaries, no memory of waking. He was not dreaming now. He was beyond dreaming, in a place where time had no meaning, where the past and the future dissolved into a single, silent present. His body lay still, the quilt rising and falling with each slow breath. The cold crept into the room, but he did not feel it. The clock ticked, but he did not hear it. The world outside, the snow-covered hills, the bare trees, the frozen river, was as distant as the stars. In that deep, dark space, the grief that had lived inside him for 3 years began to shift. It did not leave. It did not vanish. It changed shape, the way a stone changes shape when it is worn by water over centuries. The sharp edges softened. The weight, once crushing, became bearable. He did not forget Margaret. He did not let her go. He simply learned to carry her differently, as a river carries the memory of the rain that fell on the mountains, as the earth carries the memory of the ice that once covered it. He thought of the clock shop, the rows of quiet faces staring at the wall, the pendulums that swung in their endless arcs. He thought of the letters he had written, the ones he had never sent, the words he had stored in a drawer. He thought of the snow falling on the roof of the Cairngorm Arms, the fire that had burned down to ash, the woman named Eleanor who had walked the old roads and carried her loss without breaking. And he slept. The dawn came slowly, a pale, gray light that seeped through the curtains and touched the walls. The clock struck 7, a soft copper chime, and Arthur stirred. He did not wake all at once. He rose to the surface of consciousness, like a swimmer emerging from deep water, slowly, reluctantly, carrying the stillness of the depths with him. He opened his eyes, and he saw the room in the new light. The fire had died completely, and the ashes were cold. The photograph of Margaret on the mantel caught a ray of light, and her face seemed to glow, soft and warm. He looked at her, and he did not feel the familiar ache. He felt something else, something he could not name, a quiet tenderness, a gentle remembrance. He sat up slowly, and he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold under his bare feet, but he did not mind. He stood, and he walked to the window, and he pulled back the curtain. The world outside was transformed. The snow had stopped overnight, and a clear, pale blue sky stretched from horizon to horizon, as clean and fresh as new glass. The sun was low, casting long blue shadows across the white landscape. The hills rose in a series of smooth, rounded curves, their slopes shining with a soft, pearlescent light. The air was so still that the smoke from the hotel's chimney rose straight up, a thin white column against the blue. Arthur stood at the window, and he felt the peace of that morning settle into him, not as a temporary calm, but as a quiet, enduring presence. He had slept, he had let go, and he had found, in that letting go, a kind of grace he had not known was possible. Arthur dressed slowly, taking his time, feeling the weight of each garment as he pulled it on. He had not felt so present in his own body for years. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vivid, the sounds more distinct. He could hear the clatter of dishes from the kitchen below, the murmur of voices, the creak of the stairs as someone ascended, the ordinary sounds of a morning in a small Highland hotel, and they filled him with a simple, uncomplicated pleasure. He went downstairs and he found Eleanor already seated at the table by the fire, a cup of tea in her hand and a plate of toast in front of her. She looked up when he entered, and her eyes met his, and she smiled. "You look different," she said. Arthur sat down across from her, and he poured himself a cup of tea from the pot. The steam rose in a fragrant curl, and he inhaled deeply. "I slept," he said. "I slept through the night." Eleanor's smile deepened, and she nodded. "Good. The hills have a way of doing that. They take your weight, if you let them." They sat in companionable silence, eating toast and drinking tea, watching the fire take hold of the fresh logs Mrs. MacLeod had added. The morning light streamed through the windows, filling the room with a soft, golden glow. Outside, the village was waking up. A cart rumbled down the road. A dog barked. A church bell rang. A single, clear note that hung in the air like a promise. Arthur finished his tea, and he looked at Eleanor. "What will you do now?" he asked. She shrugged, a small, easy gesture. "Walk. I have a road to follow, a stretch of the old drove road that I have not yet mapped. It goes over the pass to Braemar, through the Lairig Grew. It will take me a few days, maybe a week, and then I will find another road." She looked at him, her gray eyes steady. "And you? Will you go back to London?" Arthur thought about the shop in Clerkenwell, the clocks on the wall, the silence of the parlor. He thought about the train journey home, the familiar stations, the familiar streets. And he thought about the photograph of Margaret on the mantelpiece, the way it had looked in the dawn light. "I think I will stay for a few days," he said. "I think I will walk too, just a little, just to see where the road leads." Eleanor nodded, and she did not say anything more. She finished her tea, and she stood, and she gathered her coat and her hat and her satchel. She turned to Arthur, and she placed a hand on his shoulder, a brief, light touch. "The best maps are the ones that are never finished," she said. "Goodbye, Arthur. Walk well." And then she was gone, through the door, into the bright, cold morning, her footsteps leaving small impressions in the snow that would soon be covered by the next fall. Arthur sat alone by the fire, and he listened to the ticking of the clock on the mantel. It was a simple clock, with a plain wooden face and a steady, unhurried beat. He watched the minute hand move, and he realized that he was not counting the seconds, not measuring the time. He was simply letting it pass. He reached into his coat pocket, and he took out the photograph of Margaret. He looked at her face, and he smiled, a small, quiet smile. Then he folded the photograph and put it back in his pocket, close to his heart. He rose from his chair, and he walked to the window, and he looked out at the morning. The mountains rose in the distance, white and blue and gold, and the sky was vast and clear, and the world was full of light. And Arthur Finch, clockmaker of Clerkenwell, stood at the threshold of a place he had never been, and for the first time in 3 years, he was not afraid of what lay ahead.